We finished off the other day with Schreiber.
Schreiber,
the
yes.
Schreiber example.
Yes, the judge, High Court judge. Yeah.
And before we continue, I wanted to ask if you could. You talked about man in the culture today, who's crushed the inner feminine in himself, and therefore you can see how he treats women and men and nature, where anything other than the rational mind is sort of diminished or devalued. And I was wondering, just before we continue, if you could sort of give a few examples or highlight how this might be reflected in our relationships, particularly with the significant
Sure.
other.
Yeah, sure. As you know, Anita, my partner, and I see couples. So I can give a couple of examples from that about how men are struggling today. So with this one couple we had, she discovered after years of being lied to that he in fact went to massage parlors and had sexual massages for years without telling her. And she finally twigged on it, and they came to us in a crisis. But it was his attitude towards it versus her attitude towards it that's very telling about the style of masculinity that many men have today as a carryover from the past. So her response first, she was devastated. And she saw the photographs. She saw photographs of the young Asian women, compared herself to them. She was a woman in her 50s. They compared her own body to theirs, and in her estimation, came off second best. And so she turned against her body and started to hate her body. That's a very commonplace response when you see a 20-year-old who hasn't had children, who's diminutive and curved, with the curves of youth and so on. And so a middle-aged woman seeing that her husband prefers that, she turns her rage against herself and starts to hate her own body, and that's the state she was in. He, on the other hand, was in a state of utter perplexity. He had no idea what she was going on about. His view was, and was for some weeks until we broke through, that really his activity with these young women didn't mean anything. That it was just, he was sorry it happened. He loves her and he loves his family, doesn't want to lose anything. But really, these escapades to the massage parlors the women don't mean anything, the activity didn't mean anything, and he'll stop tomorrow and it'll all be back to normal. Now that attitude is a typical masculine attitude towards the feminine. Think of how he's regarding those little Asian girls. They mean nothing. They're just flesh pots, which means, of course, that he doesn't quite take in the fact that they're treating him exactly the same way. He's a means to get an income, and he's just a flesh bag. They have no more interest in his personhood than he has in theirs. But from the man's point of view, he's revealing to his wife that he regards women as being instruments of his pleasure, instruments of his will. They mean nothing more to him than that. They don't have a soul. As I put it to one other man who came here after his wife was distraught and found him out, of course, that I asked him in the presence of his wife, did he ever imagine that these young 20-year-olds who are servicing him Did he ever imagine for a minute that she might be the daughter of a man about his age, you know, like his daughters? Did he ever imagine that? Just to sort of shift the imagination off the flesh pot to, you know, there's a real person here. So do you ever imagine her as a real person, maybe having kids? That some of these people, some of these women do this for a living to feed their kids, you know? Have you ever considered that? And he hadn't, and he had enormous resistance to that. But that's the whole idea of how men so easily, many modern men today, both of these men were in the business field, and that encourages that attitude, as we're seeing with the Me Too movement. But all of that rhetoric is based on really subjugating, diminishing, demeaning, even holding in contempt femininity, which they have to do in order for that sexual activity to be meaningless and have nothing to do with their marriage. They can successfully split them off. The women universally, in the ones we've seen, cannot do that. They cannot say, oh yeah, because they can't demean women in the way that the men could. Instead, they in their own mind, they set up a competition where they lose out to the 20-year-old, and they, you know, and they start abusing their own bodies, you know, overeating and, you know, giving up on exercise or giving up on self-care. You know, they go in the opposite direction because they see another woman there who's younger, a younger version of themselves, and that wins every time. So it's a very, very different response to femininity. That's a powerful example of how it works today on the very personal, quotidian level of day-to-day living for many people. I've talked with men who are married, happy with their family, and they go over on a business trip to Bangkok, and what they do is they take their wedding band off, and that means from now on what happens doesn't mean anything. So there's no need for me to go back and tell my wife anything, because it doesn't mean anything, and they get away with it for themselves. You know, they get away with the demeaning of women. You know, the extreme versions, of course, of the Epsteins and Weinsteins are, you know, just absolutely horrendous. But it's a very common attitude with men, and overwhelmingly the men that I've found this in have been men in the business field, the money field, financial field, where they can afford to do these things along with drugs and parties, but the demeaning of the feminine is profound, and it is resistant, absolutely resistant to being penetrated. So in the therapy, we focus on the women. Show us how you've suffered. Show us your rage. Show us your fury, and they do. It takes little prompting, and they give the man hell. But the only thing that shifts him is when the threat to leave. We're done as a family. Nothing else gets through. What he comes back with is usually I'll improve. It didn't mean anything. I can stop just tomorrow. Let's just get back to normal. That's his fear speaking, because he wanted both. He wanted security of a family and having these exciting affairs on the side. That was his framework. And just a little prompting from us, the wife just breaks that, shatters that. It's not going to happen. I'm leaving. Some do, but what the man gets to see is how much he contributed to enormous suffering in his wife. And sometimes the suffering of the feminine gets through. They're very common examples at the particular level.
Well, yeah, the suffering seems to be key in the sense of awakening or integrating that inner feminine, as you talked about in your demonstration of was it Schreiber?
Yes.
The mortificadio.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't does it, if for the men who want to do the work of integrating the feminine, doesn't always have to be so extreme as the other examples you mentioned of sort of bondage and BDSM and stuff. And
Right.
how might that look for men who want to integrate their inner feminine? And also,
Well, that's a journey. That's, you can call that the journey of individuation. You know, becoming more whole. That's totally different from men who are engaging in extreme sexual practices in order to endure the suffering and get some sexual excitement. For example, among British men, apparently, it's quite not unusual for the man to want to be submissive to a dominatrix, who so he can lick her shoes, literally, or that she can spank him on the bottom like a naughty boy until he has an orgasm. That seems to be a particularly British inflection to it, but that's nothing to do with integration. That's to do with a cultural practice that gives them relief. You know, so there's a difference between engaging in compensatory practices that bring a temporary sense of being whole, and then you slide back and you have to repeat it over and over. That's different from individuation, which is a psychological process. I have no judgment about that. I think we need to have cultural practices for people who can come into balance through odd practices like that they need to have to bring them into balance so they can go on, and then have another. Yeah, it has to be repeated. We have time-honored collective practices like the Saturnalia or the Mardi Gras as it used to be, where people could really get into their opposite. You know, like men could dress as women, or men and women could be cruel with each other, and it's all understood that this belongs to the Mardi Gras or the Saturnalia, and don't in the Middle Ages the advice was don't let your daughters out because she could get harmed, and that belongs to the Saturnalia. Nobody will get arrested, but if they do it on any other time of the year, yes, they'll get arrested. So that has to do. Also, the Day of the Dead is a very similar. It's a ritual that these seasonal rituals help bring us back into balance for another year. So that's going on today with these practices that people go to periodically. Even going to a prostitute has that flavor to it, that I can be renewed here and then go on, but I have to be renewed again and again and again. That has nothing to do with integration. Integrating the feminine is a particular psychological practice that need not involve any of those things. It could start off that way if you like, but it doesn't have to. The beginning of individuation is where the man turns to face the inner feminine, and that turning can happen through failure in relationships with real women. For example, a man could just every time I go out I fail. So failure is a way to get into that journey, and that's where the man, with help of his dreams and with a mentor perhaps, or a good therapist, they begin to learn that there is such a being as the inner feminine, and that can be distinguished. That's what's fouling up his relationships with real women. He's getting them confused. And the psychological, let's call it depth psychology. Depth psychology can help a man sort out how the anima is functioning in his life and distorting his perceptions of real women, and so he can turn to anima development as an inner practice. That's a very different kind of practice, and so he turns away from real women, temporarily at least, in order to turn towards the anima and have her teach him what she wants.